Вы санкции ввели против нас, вы нас душите и прочее. Как я часто говорю, что мы вас защищать будем? Ну и летите эти шарики.
A fatal crisis for Putin erupts on the Belarus-Lithuania border. Lukashenko and Putin thought they could bring NATO to its knees with a fake toy. When the borders closed in their faces in November 2025, a brilliant plan was devised in the strategy rooms in Minsk. They would paralyze Lithuania, not with expensive missiles, but with $100 weather balloons. On paper, this looked like a cheap and sneaky victory.
Lithuania is threatening to cut Kaliningrad off from Greater Russia. This week, Vilnius closed its land border with Belarus to prevent hot air balloons from flying into its territory.
Vilnius airport closed, flights stopped, chaos ensued. However, the real battle is not in the sky, but on the ground, at the border crossings. In October, Lithuania responded to this harassment with a very sharp decision. It closed its border crossing with Belarus. However, this retaliation was only enforced for about 3 weeks due to commercial pressures. Later, the border crossings were reopened to revive trade. Lukashenko saw this as a sign of victory and superiority. But there was one thing they didn't count on. This childish harassment cracked the patience of NATO's eastern flank. Lithuanian Prime Minister Ingrida Šimonytė's response was not that of a diplomat, but of a war commander. She declared a state of emergency.
Belarusians, and we say that no hybrid attack will be tolerated here.
Vilnius sealed not only its airspace, but also its border crossings. The government also decided to mobilize 5,000 soldiers and deploy new-generation laser weapons to rapidly increase its defense capacity. Now this Belarus's AV. There were a total of 6 gates on the Lithuania-Belarus land border. Today, only 2, Medininkai and Šalčininkai, are operating at full capacity. 2 others, Lavoriškės and Raigardas, have been partially closed since 2024, and the remaining 2, Šumskas and Tverečius, are completely sealed with 0 chance of reopening. So, at the moment, Lukashenko is boasting about his victory. 66% of the border is effectively closed, and the remaining 34% could be closed at any moment. The Lithuanian government is considering completely halting freight transport from Belarus by rail. This includes fertilizers, petroleum products, and other export goods passing through Lithuanian territory. Perhaps next in line is the dismantling of the last physical link with Russia, the railway lines. To understand the foundations of this historic break, we need to look back a little. There is also a cruel side to this crisis at the border crossings. When Lithuania closed 2 border crossings with Belarus in October in response to balloon harassment, Minsk's response was pure state banditry. Belarusian customs seized more than 5,000 Lithuanian-registered trucks in the country. The trucks were lined up silently along the roadside, their engines turned off. The drivers, exhausted from hours of police interrogation, looked sleep-deprived and anxious. And now, with the approaching freezing cold, the situation was becoming even more dire. Food was running out, water was nearly gone, and diesel was being used drop by drop. This is an unprecedented initiative in the heart of Europe, overturning international trade rules. At the time, the Belarusian Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement. Look, this is their official statement. They say, over 1,100 Lithuanian freight trucks have accumulated in Belarus. Who are they blaming? Of course, Lithuania. All additional costs stem solely from the thoughtless, deliberate and politicized actions of Lithuanian authorities. A classic accusation, an attempt to shift responsibility. However, the reality was far more dire than what the Belarusian Foreign Ministry stated. According to the Lithuanian Transporters Association Linava, the number is not 1,100. Take a look at this LRT News article. The Linava Association estimates that between 4,500 and 5,000 Lithuanian trucks and trailers are stranded in Belarus. Can you see the gravity of the situation? Nearly 5,000 vehicles, billions of euros worth of cargo, thousands of drivers, all suddenly held hostage in enemy territory. So, how did Alexander Lukashenko react to this situation? Diplomacy? A search for a solution? No. Lukashenko did exactly what was expected of him. In a move of complete panic and desperation, he resorted to blackmail. This is unbelievable. Does this sound like the words of a modern head of state? In his statement on November 10th, Lukashenko proudly recounts the order he gave to the chairman of the State Border Committee.
Автомобили.
The vehicles have been gathered up. They are secured. Those who protect them have requested €120 per day, I think.
More than 1,100 Lithuanian trucks are stranded in Belarus. Lukashenko is threatening to officially seize the civilian commercial assets of a NATO country. Why? Because Lithuania's move caught him off guard. Because the games he played to curry favor with Putin have now begun to strangle his own economy. Vilnius called it a hostage crisis. But the Lithuanian government, bowing to pressure from its own logistics companies, was forced to reopen the border. This retreat sent Lukashenko the message that blackmail works, and the balloon attacks intensified. The incident on November 29th was the last straw. At least 60 balloons launched from Belarusian forests entered Vilnius airspace. 40 of them reached areas critical to aviation safety. The airport was closed for 11 hours, stranding thousands of passengers and costing the country's economy millions of euros. The emergency to be declared will grant the authority to mobilize all necessary resources to shoot down these balloons. Now, Prime Minister Ruginiene is much more resolute. If necessary, we will completely close the border. The Lithuanian government is now considering completely halting all freight transport by rail from Belarus. Do you know what this includes? Fertilizer, petroleum products, and all other export goods that pass through Lithuanian territory to reach the world, which are the lifeblood of the Belarusian economy. This would be a complete disaster for the Belarusian economy. Lukashenko thought he could intimidate Lithuania by holding 5,000 trucks hostage. But Lithuania could cut off all of Belarus's exports and imports in response to 5,000 hostage trucks. This ultimatum reverberated through the palace in Minsk. Lukashenko, who had been making threats, was suddenly forced to make a U-turn. Lukashenko instructed Foreign Minister Maxim Ryzhenkov to hold urgent talks with the Lithuanian side on normalizing the situation and resuming the operation of border checkpoints. However, the real nuclear option on the table for Lithuania and other Baltic countries is not to shoot down balloons or close doors. It is to sever the last physical link with Russia, namely the railways. The leaders of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania have opened discussions on dismantling the railway lines leading to the Russian and Belarusian borders for the first time in such a serious and coordinated manner. This move is much more than a tactical victory on the front lines of a war. The fundamental pillar of Russian military doctrine, unchanged since the Great Patriotic War, is its absolute dependence on railways as a massive logistical backbone. Attacks on Russia's infrastructure, including its supply lines, ports and energy pipelines, aim to strangle its army. The logistical strangulation behind the front lines is now being achieved not only through chains of sabotage, but also through a political decision taken at the state level. The main effect of this decision is that it targets Russia's entire war economy. The Baltic states' dismantling plan directly cuts off the three main arteries that supply Russia's military and civilian logistics flows. Although the Rail Baltica project aims to transition to continental Europe's standard 1,435mm gauge, the timing and scope of this political decision greatly amplify the project's geopolitical impact. Currently, these lines, which use Russia's 1,520mm broad gauge system, are vital corridors for transit trade from Central Asia to Europe and from Russia's interior to Baltic ports. East-West Transit Corridor. These lines play a critical role in transferring cargo from Asian countries such as China and Kazakhstan to Europe, particularly via Lithuania and Latvia. As Latvian Transport Minister Atis Švinka has clearly stated, dismantling the lines would completely halt all transit transportation. This is a much larger geo-economic trap than Poland cutting off China's trade route. Russia is vulnerable due to its own economic dependencies. The ports of Riga and Ventspils in Latvia and Klaipėda in Lithuania are important gateways, providing Russia with access to ice-free seas. The severing of these railway lines would halt Russia's exports of oil, coal, and fertilizer through these ports. The closure of the ports would be a devastating blow to Russia's foreign trade backbone. The most destructive consequence of the dismantling plan would be the complete isolation of Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad is Russia's only enclave on the European continent, and its only physical link to the main Russian territory is the railway corridor through Lithuania. The European Union had previously allowed rail transport, despite Lithuania restricting road transit. However, the coordinated decision by the Baltic states to dismantle the railways would completely eliminate this corridor. This move is a strategic blockade, similar to turning Crimea into a death trap by leaving it blind, deaf, and isolated. Russia has two main alternatives for supplying Kaliningrad. If the railway is cut off, all supplies will have to be made by sea. However, the Baltic Sea is an extremely limited area due to the proximity of the Lithuanian and Polish coastlines. The maritime surveillance and anti-submarine capabilities of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia keep these supply lines under constant threat. Military shipments are already limited due to EU sanctions. This situation brings a scenario similar to the destruction of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea to the Baltic. The massive amounts of military equipment, heavy industry, and civilian cargo cannot be sustainably transported by air. This option leads to logistically unacceptable costs and capacity constraints. Russia's retaliatory threats and protest notes targeting Kaliningrad have been seen before, but this time the choking maneuver is much more serious. Symbolic and geopolitically significant energy moves, such as Lithuania's switch to the European electricity grid by cutting Kaliningrad and Belarus lines, have happened before. Now, the plan to dismantle the railway lines leaves Kaliningrad with a wiped-out resupply option. Russia's military posture in the region is invalidated by this decision. So, do these moves spell the death knell for Putin's nuclear stronghold? The answer lies in the map. In Putin's propaganda, Kaliningrad was marketed as an impregnable fortress, a dagger pointed at the heart of NATO. But this fortress had a fatal flaw: geography. This place was not always Russian. Until 1945, it was Königsberg, the capital of East Prussia. After World War II, Stalin annexed it, expelled the Germans, and repopulated it with Soviets. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, everything changed. Lithuania and Poland left the Union. In 2004, both joined NATO and the EU. Overnight, Kaliningrad became a geopolitical orphan, cut off from the center, yet armed to the teeth. For Putin, it was a strategic asset, home to Iskander missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads, the Baltic Fleet, and tens of thousands of troops. But there was a deadly paradox to that dagger. The more Moscow militarized Kaliningrad, the more the region became dependent on routes it did not control. Look at a map. This 98-mile exclave is separated from the Russian mainland. It is surrounded by Poland and Lithuania. To reach the region directly by road, you must come via Belarus and pass through those very closed Lithuanian border crossings, or via Poland, which has also tightened its controls. This route skirts NATO's most vulnerable point, the Suwalki Gap. This means that Kaliningrad's supply chain is a death sentence for Russia. Everything from fuel to food, spare parts to medicine must cross foreign borders to reach the region. And the most critical part, all that firepower, those vaunted Iskander missiles, that Baltic fleet, all of it needs fuel, spare parts, and constant maintenance. The railways and highways that feed that military equipment also bring groceries, medicines, and construction materials. A castle is only a castle if its supply lines work. Kaliningrad, despite all its military might, is a masterpiece of supply line dependency. And now, those lines are breaking. So, what were Putin's options in response to this situation? Option 1. Military intervention. As we saw in the first railway crisis in June 2022, the Kremlin threatened angrily. "We will retaliate," they said. But Lithuania is a NATO member. An attack on it would trigger Article 5. Could Putin risk that while bogged down in the Ukrainian quagmire? No, that bluff was called. Option 2. Sea route. Putin is trying to make urgent shipments by ship via the Baltic Sea. Ferry traffic has increased by 15%. But there are huge problems here. The cost of every ton of diesel is nearly doubling for the Kremlin. Ferries are slow and can never match the volume of trains. With Finland and Sweden's participation, the Baltic Sea has effectively become a NATO lake. Those ships are targets, just like Ukrainian drones in the Black Sea. Winter ice or storms could completely halt them. Russia had an emergency plan, a floating LNG terminal named Marshal Vasilevsky. It has been anchored off Kaliningrad since 2019. On paper, it could have supplied the region. But in reality, a complete fiasco. This terminal needs tankers to receive gas, and those tankers need ice-free and calm seas to dock. In November 2025, the Baltic Sea froze early. Icebreakers only managed to get 2 shipments through. Each tanker could only bring enough gas to sustain Kaliningrad for 12 days. So Putin's multi-million-dollar contingency plan turned out to be a lottery dependent on the weather. That's where the biggest crisis lies. Kaliningrad has one last lifeline, a gas pipeline coming through Belarus and Lithuania. However, the current 10-year critical transit agreement is reported to expire on December 31st, 2025. The date is approaching. Lithuania's Amber Grid and Russia's Gazprom are locked in negotiations, and Lithuania's hand is stronger than ever. They want higher fees. This means Lithuania holds the heat and energy tap for Kaliningrad, and if Russia wants that gas to keep flowing, Putin will have to pay the price. So, who is paying the price for all this strategic chess, this logistical stranglehold? Kaliningrad is not just a military base. It is a place where approximately 1 million people, 1 million Russian citizens live. Civilians live in the shadow of radar towers and missile silos. Schools, hospitals, and apartment blocks share the space with naval facilities. The bases run on diesel fuel from Russia, but that diesel fuel also powers the buses. Stores are stocked with goods traveling on the same rail lines as military cargo. It is a place with a dual identity, part fortress, part homeland. And when this network breaks down, it is not just a military inconvenience, it is a chain reaction that hits both soldiers and civilians at the same time. The strategic outcome of this legal blockade by Lithuania and Poland is not to militarily occupy Kaliningrad, but to make it economically unviable. This situation could potentially trigger a social explosion within the region, thereby weakening the Putin regime from within. Looking more closely at what is happening, we can already see that this strategy is working. Fuel costs in the region are said to have increased by up to 40% in just a few weeks. Transportation costs are said to have tripled. Deliveries that used to take days now take weeks. This is hitting every sector like a domino effect. Amber miners are unable to make a profit due to rising transportation costs. Fishing crews are stuck in port due to diesel shortages and unreliable refrigeration systems. Tourism is collapsing. Buses are not running. Buildings cannot be adequately heated. Remember Putin's tacit social contract with the Russian people. Obey me politically, and I will provide you with stability and security. This blockade in Kaliningrad has torn up that contract. Putin's impregnable fortress, that forward outpost bristling with nuclear missiles, is now turning into an economic prison for its own people. Those missiles don't fill stomachs. Those missiles don't stock supermarket shelves. And this situation is changing people's mood, especially the young. On social media, on Telegram channels, they see how different life is just a few kilometers across the border in Gdansk or Vilnius. The lights are bright, the shelves are full. This is a reality that even Putin's propaganda cannot cover up. So what do you think? Could this legal blockade and the chaos created by its ally Lukashenko end Putin's dominance in Kaliningrad? When will the Russian people face the reality that missiles don't fill stomachs? I look forward to your comments. Thank you for choosing us.